Joining us this week for the Wednesday Bookmark is Dr. Meera Grover. Meera is a medical doctor with the highest level of training in addiction medicine available to physicians in Canada. She currently works in Calgary at hospitals and at community sites, including shelters, street outreach, and inner-city clinics, as well as in medical education. We're going to talk this morning about her book, Why I Help People Take Drugs, Reflections of a Christian Addiction Medicine Physician. Doctor, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
So we need to begin by talking about the admittedly shocking title of the book. What really is this book about, Doctor?
So I would say that this book is a culmination of my attempts to see my work through the lens of my faith. So really, it's about why I practice addiction medicine and why I do the work that I do. And the answer is because of my faith. Yeah.
It's often said that Canada is experiencing an opioid epidemic. But if we're being honest, many of us feel a step or even a few steps removed from that epidemic. Help us understand what's going on.
Yeah, so in Canada and North America right now, we have a issue of contaminated supply, which means that many of the drugs that are being sold street level have things in them that people are not aware of. So whether you are addicted to drugs or just take drugs randomly or a friend offers you something, the death rates are actually very high right now. And that's what we mean by the opioid crisis is it doesn't actually just affect people who have addiction, but it's affecting kind of all Canadians across all walks. Actually, what we're finding is that the vast majority of people who are dying from the opioid crisis do not have an opioid use disorder, which is our medical term for an opioid addiction.
Wow.
But that it was contamination of supply. Yeah.
Wow. In your conversation on trauma, you speak about generational trauma and even the possibility of trauma being passed down from generation to generation in the DNA of people who are traumatized. I thought that was a fascinating thought. Talk more about the tight connection between trauma and addiction.
Yeah. So I'm still exploring and learning about how trauma is manifested in the body. But this is an area that psychologists have known for years, and how it works in the body is so complex, and the brain is part of the body. And so what we're learning is that also trauma impacts the brain in ways that make the brain feel that it needs to do specific things to survive. And so for some people, that can look like addiction or compulsion to use substances. And we're still unclear on how the links work through the brain. But what we know that's undeniable is that there is a link for sure.
The phrase harm reduction has become a loaded political term. What is your view on what's known as harm reduction?
You know, a lot of my work has become very political, and I really try and just see it through the lens of faith. And so, harm reduction is just things that humans do to reduce the harm of activities that are otherwise pleasurable. So, going for a drive in the mountains, I wear my seatbelt. Or going for a skate, I wear a helmet because I'm bad at skating. Or, going skiing, I wear a helmet because I'm bad at skiing. And so all of those are forms of harm reduction. So harm reduction as it's applied to using substances would look like things like sterile supplies, so that if people are going to use any ways that they're not sharing supplies and not transmitting disease. It might look like supervised consumption sites. So if people have to use that, we can bring them back. Those are kind of the concepts behind harm reduction.
And you're very open in the book about your own thought processes and your own wrestling with this issue in terms of how it aligns with your Christian faith. And I appreciate you letting us see inside your brain in that sense, because it's a complex issue.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think I've been doing this for many years, first as a nurse and then now as a addiction medicine physician. And I feel like regardless of what my role has been, my first role is as a Christian. And so I have to see it through the lens of faith and morality, or it's not worth doing. But
Hmm.
I really do believe it's worth doing. And that's just been years of thought.
In your chapter called Dogma, you say that, quote, as the church, we are asking the wrong questions about addiction. What kinds of questions, Doctor, are we asking? And what questions should we be asking instead?
I think that we are asking questions of the addicted person and sometimes of their family. We're saying, who sinned that this person is addicted?
Mm.
Was it you? Was it your family? Who sinned? And I think the questions we need to ask are, what are we doing as a society to shape the harms of addiction? What are we doing to cause addiction? What are we doing to reduce the harms of addiction? And what can we be doing as a whole? Because when we start to see addiction as a medical issue, we start to realize that it's treatable and that we can change outcomes if we decide to do so as a society. It's less about the person who's using the substances and more about our response.
And you make the point that none of us want those struggling with addiction to be within our own neighborhoods. I thought this was a really good point. We're afraid. But if we as a society want to reduce addiction, we actually need to increase connection. So how do we solve that paradox between fear and increased connection?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think that's the first step, and it's building those skills. Because when I started in this field, I mean, I still am a total square. I've never smoked a cigarette in my life. But I was scared when I started in this field. But I learned the skills that I needed, and it actually wasn't that hard. I think we have a fear of the unknown,
Mm.
but once we kind of get in there and learn, it becomes much less tricky to do.
Your last two chapters are on personal change and structural change. And we're skipping so much amazing content. It's not a very long book, but there's a lot more here. But leave us with a thought on changes that would be helpful in each of those two areas.
For personal change, I would say that it's kind of looking inwards and assessing your own stigma. Like, I was raised with a lot of stigma about addiction. I think many of us were. We all went to say no to drugs, in
Hmm.
school, and so it felt like people who do drugs are bad people. And so changing that perception, challenging myself to realize actually I am part of the problem. That I'm not going to look at how you might be part of the problem. I'm going to look at how I'm part of the problem. That I think was really pivotal for me in my journey. Structurally, I would say it's requiring those same standards of leadership to say, hey, how can we as a society move forward in a compassionate way and in a way that's respectful? Instead of sort of vilifying people who use substances. And I think that's tricky when things are criminalized. And I always kind of bring it back to, Jesus was legally convicted and sentenced to the death penalty of
Mm-hmm.
his time. And so criminality is not always reflective of morality. And so I challenge that a little bit to say, some substance, as a physician, I look at what substances do to the body, and there are perfectly legal substances that are super harmful
Mm-hmm.
and illegal substances that are not that harmful. So as we look at these things, we kind of have to challenge ourselves to be like, okay, it's not just criminality that we're going to look at, but it's just who this person is.
Mm.
And that's, I think, something that we can ask of our leaders.
I like the way you put that. As I mentioned, this is not a super long book. It's not a daunting read, but there's a lot of wisdom packed in here. It's called Why I Help People Take Drugs, Reflections of a Christian Addiction. Medicine physician Dr. Meera Grover, our guest this week for the Wednesday Bookmark. Really, really enjoyed the book, Meera. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much for having me here.